Hello there, it's Miss Hovis, and we're going to be reading chapter 26 of Serafina and the Twisted Staff with the permission of Robert Beatty, the author, and Scholastic, the publisher. Can't talk today. Alright, chapter 26. Just before dawn, Serafina crept through the darkened forest that surrounded Biltmore. In the morning's slow change from darkness to light, there was no breeze, no sound, just a stillness in the cold air and the breathing of the earth. The mist floated like long, stretching gray clouds among the branches of the trees. She was eager to find her way up to the house, but then she spotted the silhouette of what looked like a robed, hooded figure in the haze. She ducked down, squinting through the morning fog, trying to figure out who or what she was seeing. Was she too late? Was the conjurer already here? The figure appeared to be a gray-bearded man with a walking stick, moving slowly through the trees. As she studied him, he seemed to drift in and out of the mist, disappearing for several beats of her heart, and then re-emerging again. Was it the old man of the forest? Then she saw him poke his walking stick into the ground, take something small out of his satchel, kneel down, and bury it. As she crept closer, she saw that he wasn't wearing the robes that she thought she'd seen before, but a long, lightweight coat against the morning chill. It was the elderly stranger she'd seen walking in the forest with Mr. Vanderbilt, and she'd seen him again standing with the other guests the night she fled. She watched him, trying to understand what he was doing. He walked another 20 feet and then looked around, seemed to make a decision, then knelt down again. It took her several seconds to realize that the small things he was pulling out of his satchel were acorns. He was planting trees. Memories flooded into her brain like water that had been blocked behind a dam for many years. He wasn't a stranger at all. She had watched this man years before. His name was Mr. Frederick Law Umstead. He was the landscape architect who had designed the grounds of Biltmore Estate, and he was one of Mr. Vanderbilt's closest friends and mentors. Biltmore had been his last and most ambitious project before he retired. She tried to remember the last time she'd seen him. Was it 3 years ago? 4? Mr. Umstead's face was far older than she remembered, and his body more frail, like something had happened to him while he was gone. When she was just learning to prowl the grounds, she had seen Mr. Umstead supervising hundreds of men constructing the gardens, the grounds according to his design. But there had been other times, quieter moments like this, when she saw him by himself, when he didn't think anyone else was watching, walking alone with his knobby cane in his hand and his leather satchel over his shoulder, seeming to wander the fields and woodlands, planting tree after tree after tree, as if shaping the very future of the forest. It was as if he could envision in his mind what it would look like 100 years hence. And while he was a famous man who worked on a grand scale with hundreds of workers at his command, sometimes, secretly, he just liked to plant certain seeds and saplings himself. To touch the soil for touching's sake. A hickory here, a rhododendron here, bush here. Somehow he could see the future. It was hard to imagine now, years later, with Mr. Umstead's young forest flourishing all around them. But when Mr. Vanderbilt and Mr. Umstead first came to this area, most of the trees had been cut down. The farms had been spoiled, and the terrain had been what her pa called a scalded, treeless, ruined land. Her pa had told her that it was Mr. Umstead and Mr. Vanderbilt who had decided to change all that. As Mr. Umstead made his way through the forest, she realized that he must be heading out toward the squatter's clearing, one of the few remaining areas of the estate that had not yet been planted with either garden, farm, or forest. She was relieved that the elderly wanderer was Mr. Umstead, but she wondered why he had come back to visit Biltmore again after all his years away. And what was this normally peaceful man so determined to do that it got him up this early in the morning before the sun even rose? Leaving Mr. Umstead behind her, Serafina slipped quietly through the darkness into the Biltmore gardens, past the pond, along the azalea path, and to the conservatory. its thousands of steamed glass panes glistening in the morning starlight. She remembered one time when she was 8 years old. Her pa had come over to repair the hothouse's boiler, and she had prowled along the exotic plants, pretending to be a jaguar in the jungles of South America. Making her way up into the shrub garden with its meandering, crisscrossing paths, she smelled the winter bloom of the Carolina jessamine, coming with the season's crisp air, and the explosion of green and red holly and mistletoe in the surrounding woods. The yellow flower of the jessamine always reminded her that Christmas would soon arrive. But never mind gentle Mr. Olmsted and the mistletoe and Christmas, she thought, catching herself. There'd be no Biltmore at all if she didn't stop Mr. Grayson and the dark forces she'd seen in the forest. She crawled through the air shaft at the rear foundation of Biltmore House and climbed up through the metal grate. After being away for several nights, the dark, quiet, secluded corridors of the basement were a welcoming home. The smell of the pastry kitchen and the warm sheets in the laundry and all the other things she'd grown up with brought a swirl of fond memories back into her heart. She made her way to the workshop, past the benches and tools, and back to into the supply racks, where she found her pa sleeping on his mattress, gently snoring. She thought about going to her own mattress to sleep, but she didn't. Without making a sound or disturbing him in any way, she curled up beside her pa. She'd never been so happy to be home in her life. She did not wake him because she still felt ashamed of the incident that had caused her to run away. She didn't know how he would react to her when he woke, but she was sure that as he slept, he somehow knew that she was there, curled up beside him, that she was still alive, still prowling the shadows of the house and forest, and that she still loved him with all her heart. When her pa opened his eyes, he roused himself from his cot and looked at her as if to be sure he wasn't dreaming. "Pa," she said softly. He swept her up into his arms and pulled her into his great chest and swooshed her around the room, as if to capture her and never let her go. "I was so worried about you," he said, relief flowing through his words. As she felt her heart breaking free with joy, she knew she was finally home. When they settled down, she explained to her pa everything that had caused her to leave, that she never meant to hurt anyone. And as her pa started making their breakfast, he gave her a bit of a gentle talking to. "When something bad happens, Sarah, no matter how foul and painful it is, you don't go running off," he told her. "You come home, girl. You come to me and we talk about it, whatever it is. That's what kin are for. You got it?" She nodded. She knew he was right. "I got it, Pa." As they ate their breakfast, Serafina turned to darker thoughts. "Tell me what's been happening here, Pa. Is everything all right? How's Braden?" Her pa shook his head. "I'm afraid the boy's been having a hard time of it." "Did Gideon die?" she asked, her voice quivering. "The dog was terribly wounded, beyond the veterinarian's help. I don't know if they finally decided to put him out in his misery or not." A flash of heat seared Serafina's face. She pressed her lips tight together to keep the hot tears from bursting into her eyes. She took in a breath and covered her face with her hands. And then, after several seconds, she tried to continue. "Is everyone else all right?" "No, there's other bad news," he said. "Unfortunately, the stable master, Mr. Rinaldi, passed away while you were gone." What happened to him?" Serafina asked. "Was he sick?" Her pa shook his head like he still couldn't believe it. "He was kicked by a horse and killed." Serafina looked at him in alarm. "Was it one of those stallions?" "I don't know which horse it was, but it was the darndest thing. Everyone was shocked by it." "I'm sorry about Mr. Rinaldi," Serafina said. "But other than that, more guests have arrived for the Christmas Jubilee, and Mr. Vanderbilt has been very busy." "What about Mrs. Vanderbilt? Is she feeling better?" "She's been up and around on some days, but other days I don't see her at all." "Is Detective Grayson still here?" Serafina asked. "He came down here looking for you yesterday," her pa said. "What did you say to him?" Serafina asked in surprise. "I told him you were good and gone and that I didn't know where you were," which was the truth. "Good," she said. That was the best thing her pa could have said. The less Grayson knew about her, the better. "Whatever he says, whatever he does, don't trust that man, Pa." She glanced around the room to see what her pa was working on. Were you able to get the elevator gears fixed like you wanted to? Her pa nodded with satisfaction. Them gears are fit as a fiddle now, working well and fine, just like I knew they could. But your vermin have been mom-mucking again. What do you mean? Yeah, Serafina asked, confused. He stepped over to one of the benches and showed her a bundle of black-coated wires. What's that? She asked, moving towards him. The house is protected by a fire alarm system that's all tied into a central point by these here wires. But take a look. At first, Serafina thought he was showing her a wire that had been cut by snippers. But when she looked at it more closely, she saw tiny tooth marks. The wire had been chewed. I guess when you're away, the rats will play, her pa said. Them darn vermits chewed the insulation clean off, then bit right through the copper core. Never seen anything like it. If I hadn't noticed this and fixed it, the whole system would have been useless. We would have had a fire start up and get total out in hand before we had the time to put out the flames. And worse yet, people wouldn't have had time to get out. I'll see to them rats, Pa, Serafina promised, furious that she'd only been off the job for a short time, and the rats were already back. As she and her pa caught up on things, she realized how foolish she'd been to feel ashamed to see him. He had no reproach, no anger, nothing but love and concern for her. You were gone for a few long days, he said, seeming to sense what was on her mind. How far'd you go? Up into the Black Mountains, she said. The Blacks? He said in surprise. That's way back up in through them there rocks. Must have been awful bad cold this time of year. Not too bad, she said. Did Superintendent McName and his men go out into the forest to look for that poacher? Her pa nodded. They went out, came back, didn't see nothing, but they found all manner of tracks out there. There's something bad coming, Pa, she told him. What are you talking about? He asked, looking at her with a seriousness in his eyes. There had been a time when he didn't have ears for her stories, but that time had passed. But even as he laid out the question before her, she realized how difficult it was going to be to explain everything she'd learned. I got a glimpse of something nasty in the forest, and it's coming this way, she said. Just be careful, Pa, and tell me if you see anything unusual, all right? Her pa stared at her, silent and unblinking, not liking her answer one bit. She'd gotten his attention full and earnest now. You're acting like you saw a haint or some such, he said quietly. I did, Pa, she said. I did. She didn't mean that she had literally seen a ghost, but it was the only way she could get to the gist of it. A man, a haint, a demon, a spirit. She had no idea what he truly was, but she knew he would come. And Grayson was already crawling beneath their very noses. The first thing she needed to do was to somehow gain Braden's trust again, warn him about what she'd learned, and develop a plan of attack. It made her all qualmish in her gut whenever she tried to think about what she was going to say to Braden, about what happened with Gideon. But she knew she had to do it. When they heard the first sounds of the servants down the hall, she and her pa realized it was time for them to start their day. She said goodbye to him and went down the corridor. As she passed the open door of the servants' washroom, she saw her reflection in the little mirror above the basin. She gave it nothing but a glance as she walked by. But then she stopped, backed up, and looked again, surprised by what she saw. Given how she'd occupied herself while she was away, it didn't surprise her that the dress that Essie had lent her was torn and stained. She'd need to apologize to Essie and somehow replace it. And she saw, too, that her face had been marked by a rather gruesome variety of cuts and scratches to go along with the vicious scar from the neck wound she'd suffered a few weeks before. She was not a pretty sight, but what truly gave her pause were her eyes. All her life, her eyes had been a soft golden amber color, but now they looked bright yellow. She frowned and growled a little in frustration. She seemed to be evolving from merely peculiar looking to positively hideous. She went up the back stairs to the main floor, ducked into a heating register, then shimmied her way up a vertical metal shaft to the second floor. Crawling through the air shaft down to Braden's end of the house reminded her of their adventures a few weeks before. She came to the register that supplied Braden's bedroom, and peered through the decorative metal wall grate beneath his desk and into his room. Her heart swelled when she saw that Braden was there. She so desperately wanted to push open the grate and speak with him, explain what had happened, and try to convince him one more time that she never meant to hurt Gideon. But then she saw something that shocked her. Gideon was lying on the floor next to Braden. He's alive. She didn't know how that was possible, but she was so glad and relieved. Gideon lay in a soft bed of pillows that Braden had made for him, his eyes shut as Braden stroked his head. He was clearly gravely wounded, but he was alive. "I'm here with you, boy," Braden said to his dog as he gently petted his ears. When the tears seeped out of Serafina's eyes, she quickly pulled back from the grate and crawled down the shaft a few feet, sitting alone in the darkness. She hugged her knees to her body and covered her face. If she watched Braden and Gideon any longer, she'd start sobbing, from sadness, but mostly from relief that he was still alive. And no one wanted to hear sobbing in their heating register. Serafina heard the faint sound of approaching footsteps. She crawled to the adjacent register, which looked out into the hallway. Whoever it was had stopped walking. He was just standing there outside Braden's door. What was he doing? She could see his shoes and trousers, but she couldn't see his face because of her low position. She knew it wasn't Mr. Vanderbilt, for she knew his shoes well. She pressed herself to the floor and tried to look upward. Now she could see that the man standing outside Braden's door was holding a spiraling wooden cane with a hooked antler handle, and he had straggly rat brown hair. Suddenly she felt the closeness of the shaft she was hiding in, the dusty air moving in and out of her lungs. She tried to stay calm, but her chest rose and fell more and more heavily as she waited and watched. She expected the man to knock, but he did not. He leaned forward, pressed his ear against the door, and listened. The rat was spying on Braden. That's the end of chapter 26.